Welcome to the Fenton Forecast. I'm your host, David Fenton. So you're sitting with your uncle, he's a Republican, and you're talking about climate change. And he says, well, hasn't the climate always changed before? And you don't know how to answer. How do you answer? So my guest today, Dr. Katharine Hayhoe, knows how to do it. And we're going to go over the 6 main ways to talk simply to your uncle about climate change. Katharine Hayhoe is a distinguished climate scientist, and she's also a Christian evangelical climate scientist based in Lubbock, Texas, at Texas Tech University, where she deals with talking to people across the political spectrum all the time. And as you'll see, she's a master at it. She is the most followed climate scientist online, and I wish she was better known. Hopefully this will help. So over to my interview with Dr. Katharine Hayhoe. Welcome to the Fenton Forecast. My guest today is one of my favorite people on planet Earth, Dr. Katharine Hayhoe, the climate scientist at Texas Tech University in Lubbock, Texas. And she's trying to save the people and creatures on Earth. In fact, she wrote a great book called Saving Us. Katharine is a top climate scientist and has a real knack for explaining this issue to people in simple terms they can understand. And warning, she is a big dose of optimism. So if you're expecting a bunch of fear today, that's not what you're going to get. So welcome to the Fenton Forecast, Katharine.
Thank you so much, David. And just to be clear, I could totally deliver fear if that was what worked. But I, as you, go with what the science says on effective communication. And the science says that that is not enough to get people to act.
Yeah, for sure. It just shuts down people's nervous systems. I often would say to people, don't do what I did. Don't spend time with climate scientists. It might ruin your life. But when I talk to you, I feel very differently. In fact, it's very funny. Once a top advertising executive looked at videos I made with you, Katharine, and he said, oh, she makes me feel so good about the end of the world. But that world can keep going on. We can solve this problem. So Katharine, you talk a lot about the 6 key truths about the climate change situation that the people at the Yale Center on Climate Change Communication keep talking about. So do you want to go through those and tell us what are the biggest misconceptions and challenges about each? Right? Should we start with the first one, that climate change is real and is happening?
Yes, that is the first thing we need to know. If we don't think climate change is real or we don't think it's happening, then there's no more discussion to be had. So we know that climate is changing, and we know it's changing faster than any time in human history. But often people will say, oh, it's not changing. Climate has always changed. Why is this any different? And, maybe those thermometers in cities are just getting warmer because the city's growing. But the reality is that when we look at thermometers, when we look at satellites, when we look at almost 30,000 natural thermometers around the world, that's when the cherry trees blossom, when the birds migrate, when glaciers are melting and sea levels rising. We see consistently around the world that climate is changing. And not only is it changing, it's changing faster and faster. And so that's why what's happening today is so different than before. It's really the scale of the change that is unusual and very concerning.
Yeah. Somebody put it to me the other day that this amount of change before humans were around in the Earth's climate used to take 100 million years. We're doing it in 100 years.
Yes.
So that gets us to point 2, that it is human caused. It is caused by human activity. And so what's the biggest challenge and misconception you face in communicating that?
Well, the interesting thing is that even people who totally agree with the science and would say, of course, climate is changing, humans are responsible, they don't know how much of the warming humans are responsible for. And so sometimes I ask people, how much do you think that we're responsible for? And people say, well, maybe 60%, maybe 70%, maybe 80%. But the real answer is more than 100%. And people might say then, well, how can you have more than 100%?
That
It's
sounds like
because,
Trump's math.
yeah, exactly, but it isn't. This is actual science. According to natural factors, because of course natural factors are always at work, changes in energy from the sun, natural cycles, volcanic eruptions. According to natural factors right now, the Earth should be getting cooler. And instead, it's getting warmer faster and faster. So when people say, well, isn't it just the sun or a natural cycle? What they don't know is that according to those factors, the Earth should be cooling. And instead we're warming, and humans are responsible for all of the warming and then some.
You know, I like to be careful in just saying humans are responsible because that sounds like we're all equally guilty. We can get to this later. As you know, some people are more responsible than others.
Oh, yes, that's definitely true. And so just to be clear on how are humans responsible, because then people are like, well, is it just like our breathing or is it like all of our plastic pollution? No. The number one way that we're causing climate change is by digging up and burning coal, gas, and oil. And that produces heat trapping gases that are building up in the atmosphere, wrapping an extra blanket around the planet, which is a metaphor that you have tested and you've shown that it's very effective at actually communicating what's happening. And just like you would if someone snuck into your room at night and put an extra blanket on you, you wake up saying, hey, I'm too warm, I don't need the blanket. In the same way, our planet is running a fever because of this extra blanket that we're wrapping around it, most of which comes from burning coal, gas, and oil, and the rest of it comes from deforestation and large-scale industrial agriculture.
Yeah, the so-called pollution blanket, which is a concept people can really understand. And as you know, the thing about the word pollution is that everybody knows what it is, and no one likes it. So we don't like this blanket of pollution, and the seeds of the solution are also in that metaphor. We can talk about that in a minute. So the next point that we need to establish for people is that experts agree. So, of course, there's a lot of controversy about this. So set us straight, please.
Mm-hmm. So all of our media online gets more clicks and views if they have people arguing with each other. And so often when you hear people talking about climate change, you just hear them arguing. And then, even worse, a lot of very traditional news media feels like, well, we should avoid bias. So if we're going to include one person who says X, we should also include somebody who says Y. Now, thankfully, they don't do it nearly as much now as they used to. But for a long time, that was the case. But just because you have somebody who says gravity is real, and there might be somebody else who doesn't think gravity is real, it doesn't mean that you feature their opinion if they're dead wrong. And that's exactly the case with climate change. We've actually known since the 1800s that digging up and burning fossil fuels is producing heat-trapping gases that are wrapping this extra blanket around the planet, causing it to warm. The warming of the planet was measured by a scientist named Guy Callender back in 1937. That's how long we've actually known the planet was warming. And scientists were worried enough about the impacts of this warming to formally warn a U.S. president, Lyndon B. Johnson, in 1965.
Right.
So people often think, because of all the misinformation and disinformation online, misinformation being, I'm not sure if it's true or not, disinformation being, I know it's not true, but I'm going to say it anyways. They think that there's expert people out there who say climate isn't changing or humans aren't responsible or the impacts aren't serious. There aren't.
Right.
There's certainly people who are not expert who say that, but research has showed that the simple phrase, experts agree, actually has a huge impact on people's opinions.
Right. In fact, the Yale research shows that most people think that there's still enormous disagreement about this in the scientific community when there's consensus, at least among actual climate scientists. I mean, there are all kinds of people who are engineers or, scientists in different disciplines who don't know anything about it, who sign petitions, who say it's not true. But the people that actually work in this field are unanimous. And isn't it true that every major scientific academy in the world is also in agreement that our pollution is warming the earth?
Oh, yes. And not only every scientific academy in the world, but over 3 million peer-reviewed studies. Right. And in fact, a few years ago, a number of colleagues and I got together and we found 37 studies. So compare 37 to 3 million. We found 37 studies that have been published in the last 10 years that purported to claim either that climate wasn't changing or that humans weren't responsible. We reanalyzed every single one of those studies from scratch, which is a lot of work. It's like doing 37 studies just for one. And in every single one of them, we found at least one mistake, like an actual error. In some cases, it was a mathematical error. In some cases, they just left out a term in the equation, or they made an assumption that was not true. That if you corrected that error, it brought that study 100% into line with all the other studies on this topic.
Right. You hear that, Joe Rogan? Joe Rogan, as you know, has been unfortunately spreading complete confusion and disinformation about this incredibly important topic. You know, I thought maybe we should like surround his house and start chanting or something. We need to do something about this guy. He's really confusing people, and he should have you on. So viewers, listeners, let's write to Joe Rogan. Let's have Dr. Hayhoe come on the manosphere, please, if you can handle it. Okay, next point is it's bad. It's causing harms. We have to establish that too, don't we?
We do, for a couple of different reasons. So first of all, there's a lot of disinformation on, oh, wouldn't the planet being warmer be better? And I mean, I'm from Canada, and I certainly appreciate nice warm weather when we get it. But unfortunately, this warming of the planet, which is occurring faster than any time we've ever seen, is triggering all kinds of harmful consequences, even in a northern location like Canada, let alone everywhere else. So
like the fires.
Yes, exactly. One of the biggest ways it's affecting us is through loading the weather dice against us. All of our extreme events are getting stronger, more intense, more devastating, more dangerous, and that affects us all. We're seeing impacts on our food, our crops, our insurance rates, our water availability, the security of our homes. So not only the direct disinformation about, oh, warming is good, but there's also something called psychological distance. And I think of that as just the head to heart gap. And data shows that most people are worried, even in the US, about 2/3 are worried.
That's 0.5.
Sorry?
That's 0.5. Most care.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
But no, they're worried, but they don't know how it affects them. They haven't connected the dots between, the ocean circulation or the ice sheets or global temperature and their grocery bill, their insurance rates, their kids' asthma attacks, all of that stuff. So we have to explain not just how it's bad, but how it's bad in a personal way, like how it affects the people, the places, the things we care about, not just at the global scale, because we have to bridge that head to heart gap. Otherwise, when people make day-to-day decisions, they don't know how to incorporate climate into those decisions because they think it's a big global issue that they, not being a global leader, can't do anything about.
Right. Okay, so most care and support action, we've covered that. So the final point may be the most important, that there's hope, that there are things we can do to avoid the worst of this. And there may even be things we can do to take some of this pollution out of the atmosphere in time. So how do you talk to people about hope?
Mm-hmm. Well, hope is directly tied to the previous point that others care, because it turns out that not only do the majority of people care, most of us don't think they care. So in every country around the world, the number of people who they say they care is always higher than the number of people who they think care in their country. Mm-hmm. And that matters, because if we think that we're alone or in the minority, then we're not really that motivated to act. Whereas if we know there's lots of other people, then it motivates us, right?
Yes, because otherwise, what difference is my, getting a heat pump or a solar panel going to make? It's just a drop in the bucket. And so when you see that others want to do this and are doing it, I mean, there are these studies that you know of that in a neighborhood, if a few people put solar panels on the roof, it doesn't do much. But once there's a certain number of them in penetration in a neighborhood, then everybody wants to do it. And that's infectious. So, okay, it's real. It's humans. Experts agree. It's bad. It's hurting us. Most people do care about this and support action, and there's hope. That's your 6-part message.
It is. And the hope part is really important, because that's what we hear the least.
Right. And there's so much, I've just finished interviewing the chair of the California Energy Commission, David Hochschild, who there's now more electric vehicle charging plugs in California than gas station nozzles, twice as many. And he told me that China just created 68 gigawatts of solar panels in 1 month. Folks, that's the equivalent of 68 nuclear power plants of energy in 1 month. The electric cars in China now cost $10,000 and soon will go 350 miles on a 5-minute charge. So we really are, and in California and countries like Portugal and Spain and Scotland, we're up to 70% clean power and growing. So this is a solvable problem. Unfortunately, we are in a race, and we can talk about that, a race against time. So hope and action. So talk about your view between the difference between individual action, what people can do to make a difference, and the need for collective action, because this is at a big scale, this problem. Individual action alone isn't going to do it, right?
Alone, it's not. But together is the only way we can do that. And how do you change a system? You change a system when individuals within that system are calling for it to change. So the role of individuals is key, but not the way we're usually told. So 99 times out of 100, when you have somebody telling you, what can you do to help fix climate change? Literally 99 times out of 100, possibly even more, they will be talking about what you eat, what you drive or what you don't drive, how you power your house. You'll have information on plant-based burgers and plant-based milks and solar panels and EVs and things like that. And don't get me wrong, all of those are great ways to reduce your personal carbon footprint. But reducing your personal carbon footprint is not the most important way you can tackle climate change.
But what is?
And the most important way to tackle climate change is, as Bill McKibben says, for an individual to not be such an individual. We have to change the system so that the easiest and most affordable choice for anyone, the no-brainer default choice, is actually the best choice. And right now, it's the opposite. Right now, for most people, the easiest and most affordable choice is the worst choice. So we have to flip the system. And to flip the system, the number one thing that we have is our voice. And we are not using our voice. The Yale data shows that most of us don't even hear somebody else talk about climate change 2/3 of the time.
Right.
And if you don't talk about it, why would you care? And if you don't care, why would you ever do anything about it? So the first thing that any individual can do is so simple that people often sort of just almost instinctively reject it when they hear it. But it isn't being done.
Right. And people also, they're not talking about it. They're not seeing much about it in the media. Only 12% of Americans see or hear anything about climate change online. I think that that's certainly true, that people need to talk about it and to stop being afraid to talk about it. And we can give people pointers on how to talk about it. You're very good at that. And let's talk about that. So, but the other collective action, of course, is we're not going to tell you who to vote for, but you should please vote for people who are going to make the planet livable and sustainable, not who are working to help people that are making money trying to kill us all. So that would be good.
Oh, yeah. Well, in fact, if you go down the list of the most effective things people can do, number one is have a conversation that connects the head to the heart to the hands. So not just what's happening, but yeah, why it matters and what we can do. Number two, amplify your voice by joining a climate action group. So your voice is speaking together. Number three, to use your voice where you go to school or where you study or where you work. Number four is to speak with your money, because what you do and don't buy and where you bank and where you put your retirement can have a huge impact. And then after that, use your voice how you vote. And it's not only about voting, it's also about having conversations, because a lot of the most important climate decisions are not made at the federal level.
Right.
They are made, in fact, I live in Texas, where the number one elected role that has the biggest influence on greenhouse gas emissions in Texas is the railroad commissioner.
Right.
And that's not exactly what you consider like a hot voting role.
Well, it's an obscure post people around the country don't know about, but it is very powerful in Texas.
It is.
So speaking of Texas, if I can get a little bit personal with you for a minute. So as I understand it, when you met your husband, he was a skeptic about climate change. And your husband is an evangelical pastor in Texas. So what was that like? How did you convince him?
Well, I would put it this way. He had never heard anyone who shared his beliefs and shared his values connect climate change to those beliefs and values.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really the key, because if we continue to communicate this as it's a left-wing thing that only people on the left care about, and if you haven't hugged a tree already, then you don't even qualify to care about this issue, then we're not going to get everybody else on board. Whereas if we start where people already are in terms of what they care about, and we help connect the dots, which frankly, I think you can do for almost everyone. I mean, maybe there's 1 out of 1,000 people that you really can't connect the dots for, but everybody else cares about something. Then you can help them see that who they already are is already the perfect person to care. And so that was something I learned firsthand through conversations that we had. And then after I moved to Texas, conversations I had with people in Texas. And it all sort of culminated when, after I wrote my book, Saving Us, CBS wanted to interview me. But they didn't just want to interview me. They wanted me to be having conversations with people live. So they said, okay, we're going to go to like an aquarium in Dallas, and we're just going to pick random people for you to approach, and you're going to figure out what they care about and connect that to climate. And we're going to film it. And I was like, oh, great. This is going to be the one time it doesn't work. So we went to this aquarium, and, you know, I had some great conversations with some young woman about fashion and climate. And, you know, I had some conversations with some other people about food and climate. And then they saw this man who was wearing a cap with a picture of an oil rig on it. And they're like, him, you have to go talk to him.
Right. It was your Charlie Kirk moment.
Yes. So I was like, okay, I mean, I'll give it a try. So I went up and started a conversation with him, and, you know, asked him if he thought about climate change. And he said, no, I don't think about it at all. It has nothing to do with me. So he wasn't hostile, but he just, you know, figured it was not related. But he was there with his little daughter. And so I started to ask him about his little daughter and where he was from. And he was from Oklahoma, and they'd driven down a couple of hours. It turns out that his daughter was the light of his life, and she loved to play outside, and she loved to see animals, but it was too hot in the summer for her to play outside.
Mm-hmm.
And he was always worried about her playing outside too much. And he would try to get her to come inside, and she wouldn't want to come in, but he was worried about her health. And so that's why they drove all the way down to Dallas to take her to this aquarium. And so that was like an immediate hook to why climate change mattered, because actually, even as you and I are speaking, David, just this week, Yale came out with a new study showing how people just underestimate the impacts of extreme heat and how dangerous it can be.
Yeah.
So every time I think it's not going to work, it actually ends up working if we spend enough time actually asking questions and listening to what the person says about what they care about, and then making the connection not to what we care about, but to what they do.
Okay, that all makes sense, but it's still very challenging. I mean, especially take a state like Texas and Oklahoma or North Dakota. These are states where their economies are dependent on fossil fuel drilling, and that's their way of life. And it's such a big challenge, of course, that we're going to have to explain to these people over time that their industries must transition to safer energy for their sake, for everybody's sake. And there's a lot of resistance to that, whether it's a resistance to accepting that oil, coal, and gas are doing that, or to the changes that we need to make. So what do you find works when you're talking to people that are that resistant? Because, you know, while most people support action, politically, we have to get more people in these states to understand what's at stake, don't we?
We do. We don't have to convince the 10% that are dismissive.
Right.
But there's a lot who are understandably concerned that the way they put food on the table is by working in the fossil fuel industry. And there's many towns. I mean, there's coal mining towns in West Virginia and Utah. There's oil towns in Texas and Louisiana. And people don't know what a different way of life would look like.
Yeah.
And asking them to change without offering something that's better than what we have today is, first of all, not fair. And second of all, it just isn't going to happen. Right. Because our brain is wired to move forward towards something better than what we have today, not worse. So I've certainly had my share of conversations, and I even had a student in my class this year who was in this exact situation because her boyfriend worked in the fossil fuel industry, and she was taking a class on climate change. So it was really fun because I got to see her sort of figuring out how to put this in action herself over the course of the class. And where I often start, and I know you do too, David, is first of all by recognizing that energy, especially electricity, but energy in general, is key to human well-being.
Yeah.
And what they are doing is they're providing an essential service that if the whole thing, if there was a magic switch flipped today and just turned off all fossil fuels, there would be a lot of suffering.
Terrible.
A lot of grief, a lot of pain. So it isn't about flipping a magic switch. And it definitely is not about demonizing the individuals who work in that industry simply to put food on the table for their families.
No, in fact, I've long urged that we do a campaign thanking the fossil fuel workers and even the fossil fuel industry. It would go something like this. This gets me in a lot of trouble with certain activists. So thank you. You've created the greatest prosperity humanity has ever known. We live much longer. We can fly everywhere. We can heat our homes. We can power our industries. Bravo. Great job. However, now, as you know, we have to change how we get energy so we don't threaten the very prosperity that you so magnificently helped us create. So surely your business plan, your business model isn't to destroy everything that you created, is it? So that's, I think, part of how we have to talk to people is to acknowledge that what they've done is a great thing. And of course, at the same time, it's important people to know that the fossil fuel executives, as opposed to the workers, were told by their excellent scientists 50 years ago that their products were going to overheat the earth, melt the ice, put cities underwater, make the price of food unaffordable. They've known all this for 50 years, and they went out and lied about it and covered it up and funded disinformation. And so, to me, those people are in a somewhat special category. As a guest I had on recently said that the fossil fuel workers should have a just transition. The executives should have a trial at The Hague. And then, I don't mean to embarrass you, but Jane Fonda, when she was in Texas, she gave a speech and she said, "Ladies, it's time to stop sleeping with fossil fuel executives." She said, "You can sleep with the workers, but not the executives anymore."
Maybe that would actually make a difference.
Well, you have to laugh to keep from crying because these people, of course, now they own the U.S. government and they certainly own the Texas government, and they're very greedy and they want to make every last penny from every last drop, knowing full well what it's doing to us. And this is really the fight of our lifetimes, to have flourishing humanity. We have all the solutions that we need pretty much, but we have some very greedy actors in the way. And, on the right, people don't like corruption. I find when I talk to people on the right about this, the corruption angle bothers them and is one way in. Another way, I wonder what you think about this, that I try to talk to people that are skeptical. Again, most people are not so skeptical, but they tend to get undue attention. I say, well, what is it about the scientific fact that carbon dioxide molecules trap heat on Earth that used to go back out to space? What is it about that bothers you so much? I genuinely would like to understand. As you've put it so eloquently, Katharine, thank goodness carbon dioxide traps heat on Earth, because if it didn't, the Earth would be a frozen snowball. We'd be freezing. But so it's a good thing.
We wouldn't be here.
Right.
We wouldn't be here.
There'd be no life on Earth. So but, so a lot of them like to say, well, it's a good thing, plants need it. And you'll say, well, yeah, but you can have too much of a good thing, right? Like water's great, too much of it and you'll drown. So I try to engage with people that way. What do you think works best?
Well, about 99% of denial is solution aversion.
Right.
99% of it is, I don't want to fix it because I have been told that the solutions are diametrically opposed to my ideology or my identity, or will make my life worse or poorer or less enjoyable than it is right now. And sadly, many environmentalists are actually complicit in that messaging.
That's true.
But here's the thing. Here's where our subconscious motivated reasoning comes in. We think, but I'm a good person. And so if this thing were really real and we're really disproportionately harming the poorest and most vulnerable people in the world, which it is, then I would want to fix it. But I don't want to fix it. So that means that it can't possibly be real. And then what people do is then they use their giant brain. And sadly, the smarter we are, the better we are at doing this. They go out and they look for excuses to explain why they don't want to fix it. But 99 times out of 100, when you get right to the bottom of it, it's that they actually believe that the solutions pose a direct threat to something or someone they hold dear, including their own lives.
So go ahead. Sorry.
So I've often found myself that if you can get people on board with a solution without even talking about the science, and there's a solution that they can see actually improves their life and makes them an even, better version of who they already are, a shrewder business person, or they're making more money, or they're more independent, then often actually their objections to the science evaporate.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. If you put solar on your roof and you're energy independent and your price can't go up because, folks, the sun can never go up in price. That's one of the good things about it. Then you're more open to accepting that we need to do this. I think that that's certainly true. I remember a pretty well-known writer said to me once, well, you environmentalists, I want to be able to take vacations.
Yes.
And I said, well, of course you should take vacations. We all should take vacations. We should take more vacations. We're just going to power how you get there differently so it doesn't make a hotter planet. You should drive everywhere you want. You should heat your home, but we now know how to do these things without heating the planet. The physicist Amory Lovins told me a few weeks ago that he's confident that we're going to get pollution-free electrified airplanes, even coast-to-coast airplanes, because they're progressing so quickly. And David Hochschild, the chair of the California Energy Commission, just told me that electrified aviation is now a $6 billion industry in California and making rapid strides. So yeah, dear environmentalists, sacrifice doesn't sell. And we don't really have to sacrifice. I mean, there will be some sacrifices. Of course, really excess consumption is not good for anybody. But the basics of modern health and life and transportation and energy and industry can go on, of course, and be better than ever. This is the other thing that excites people, is that clean energy is cheaper. And it keeps getting cheaper because the more we buy, the cheaper it gets, the more we buy. So these are great messages, and they're true. But Katharine, we also do have to help people understand that we don't have a lot of time to avoid even worse consequences than we're experiencing now. So I know you mostly like to inspire people with hope, and I agree, but how do we best help people understand the urgency?
So there's three really important ingredients to effective communication, in my opinion: the head, the heart, and the hands. And so far, most of our communication, speaking, globally, has been the head. In fact, I would venture to say like 99% has been the head. So as a result, more people know about the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation than ever had before. But if they don't know why that matters to them, and if they have no clue what to do about it, and they think that the biggest solution they can do is recycle, then nothing's ever going to happen. So, unfortunately, the worse the situation gets, the more urgency we feel who understand just how urgent this is, the more people start to double down on the messaging about how it's going to be too late. And if we pass this threshold, it's all over. And the definition of insanity is doing the same thing again, expecting different answer, different result. We've been communicating in this way for years and decades, and it hasn't got us where we need to go. And in fact, it's not even scientifically accurate. According to the science, every bit of warming matters. And while there are tipping points in the climate system, we actually don't know when those are going to happen. We just know that the more we do, the worse it's going to get. So the very people who are feeling the urgency double down on the way of communicating that didn't get the solution that they wanted and the action they wanted. And they actually get more and more and more strident about it. And we're actually seeing, David, and I'm sure you've seen this too, we are seeing a reaction to that urgency and stridency where people's defense mechanisms are kicking in and they are literally dissociating from this issue and giving up. So they've gone so far to the edge of the spectrum with alarmed that they literally can't hold that anxiety any longer and they are giving up, which is the opposite of what we want. So I definitely talk about the head. If you don't know what's happening and why it matters, why would you even want to fix it? But it's interesting that I'm always characterized as only talking about the hands, because somehow if you talk about the hands more than 1%, people think you're talking about the hands all the time. I'm like, no, I'm talking about what's happening. I'm talking about why it matters. And I'm talking about what the solutions look like. But we're so biased towards only talking about how bad it is and the Armageddon we have to avoid that any attempt to talk about a better future that we want to move towards, which is what neuroscience actually says our brains will do, we will move forward towards something that's better than what we have. Any attempt to do that, even 1%, will get you branded as a hopium peddler.
Right. Well, few things in the universe or life are binary. And
right.
So, this is not a choice between motivating people through hope or choosing to motivate them through fear. You have to do a little of both in the right proportion simultaneously, it would seem to me.
Yes.
Because, and one way to do that is to talk about our choice. So we have in front of us the ability to have a much better world. It's really exciting. It's safer, it's cleaner, it's cheaper, it's actually sustainable. It will make the price of energy go way down. It actually will create abundance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
This is incredible that this is at our fingertips. At the same time, we have people trying to slow this down and keep us from getting to that better, cheaper, cleaner world. And if we let them slow us down too much, we're going to have heat waves and storms and droughts that we really are not going to like. So this is a positive world in front of us. We need to get the people out of the way that are trying to stop us. That seems to work, don't you think?
Yes. I mean, that's like what you're just saying is you need the head, right? So you need to understand the urgency. You need the heart to understand what's at stake personally. And then you also need the hands, which tells you what to do with that information about what you know and why it matters.
Sure. But, you talk about the AMOC, the ocean current. Very few people have heard of that, Catherine.
Unless you're
very small.
You hear about it very regularly.
And you see how the other side is weaponizing even that. Oh, Al Gore says that, now we're going to freeze because when the Gulf Stream shuts down, Northern Europe will freeze. Mm-hmm. So, I think that we need to do personally that we need to probably do something like 70% positivity hope. But if we don't do 30 or 25%, this is going to be bad if we don't move towards the better world fast. I don't know that we'll get there. So, it's an art. It's a difficult thing to do, but I think we have to do both.
It is, but I'm just kind of curious why you would think that I don't think we have to do both.
Well, you're emphasizing that we've talked about all the bad things so much that we're shutting people down. And that's true, but we have to talk about it some because most people still don't understand how urgent it is. And there's a cognitive science issue here too, which is when you say pollution, what the mental frame you're activating in people's brains is an image of a smokestack with soot going up, right? And so what's inherent in that image is it goes up and then it comes down. The pollution comes down. So as I've learned from you and the other scientists, the carbon dioxide pollution from fossil fuels goes up, but it doesn't come down for centuries or even more. And that is hard for people. And don't we need people to understand that? And that's why we have to hurry up and reduce the pollution?
I'm not sure about the coming up and down part, but I have figured out what the misconception is that we're talking about, which is super helpful for me. So I mentioned that successful climate communication requires the three parts, right? So you have to have what's happening, how bad it is, why it matters, and what we can do.
Yeah.
And I also mentioned that like 99% of communication up until this point has just been this, right? So when I'm talking about successful communication, I do not mean that we need to make up the balance. I don't mean that we had 20 years of head, and so we need 20 years of hands to make up for it. What I mean is within any conversation, even if you have 30 seconds of conversation, you need all three of those.
Yeah, that's
so I'm talking about restoring the balance, not going way overboard on the other direction.
Okay, good. That's very fair.
Yeah.
Okay.
Very helpful distinction too.
So let's move on to another topic. So Katharine, you are a practicing Christian evangelical. You're married to an evangelical preacher who I understand has quite a following on Sirius XM radio. Is that right? What's his name again?
It is Andrew Farley. He has a live call-in show on Sirius XM and about 200 other radio stations every night.
Okay, great. A plug for Andrew. And you're a scientist. So do you find a conflict between your faith and this science? How does that work? Which came first for you?
Honestly, I don't know which came first. Because I grew up in a home where not only was my dad one of the teachers in our local church, but he was also a science teacher. So I got both of them at the same time from day one. And the concept that I grew up with is that if, as a Christian, and this obviously applies if you're Jewish too, if we believe that the Bible was inspired by the very same God who created this universe, then how could studying God's word possibly be in conflict with God's creation? Now, obviously, I'm not naive. There are certainly examples where people think that they are in conflict with each other. But if that's the case, who's at fault? Is it not our limited understanding, our sort of thick glasses, our lack of knowledge or our biases that are leading to this perceived conflict? Because fundamentally, if you take the Bible seriously, then it says God created the heavens and the earth and the entire universe. And so what is science other than trying to figure out how all of that stuff works? So for me, there's never been a conflict. And when there's been the appearance of a conflict, I just realized with a little humility that, we don't understand everything right now. Science evolves over time. Our understanding of theology also develops over time and is often read with, like I said, some very thick cultural glasses. But I would say that the one issue that I have, the one difficulty, the biggest challenge I have is the fact that in the United States, Christianity has become so politically polarized. Today, 40% of people in the US who call themselves evangelical don't even go to church. They're just catechized by Fox News and the rest of right-wing media. And as climate change has become the most politically polarized issue in the US, which has been at or near the top for the last 15 or 20 years, many people who call themselves Christians think that it's actually a statement of faith for them to reject what God's creation is telling us about what's happening to our planet.
Right.
And because of that, I hate to say this, but the vast majority of the hate I get is from people who actively identify as Christians. And when somebody who has Bible verses in their profile is calling you horrible four-letter names and just cursing you out and incentivizing, whipping up other people to pile on, it's tremendously discouraging. And it really makes me question, as a Christian, you believe that God's Spirit is active in people's lives. And it first makes me question, are these people Christian? Probably a lot of them are not. And if they are, like, where is God telling them to shut it?
Yeah, well, God's not on Facebook or Fox News too much, I guess.
There is the tweet of God on X, but he just got blocked by Elon Musk.
Is that right? No free speech for God?
No, heaven forbid. That's the last person who should be having free speech.
Oh my goodness. So people have asked you, the earth is so big, the atmosphere is so complex. These are miracles of creation. Isn't God in charge of these? How could humans do something to affect God's creation at that scale? How do you answer them?
That is the number one religiously sounding myth when it comes to climate change. And to answer religiously sounding, and I'm not being cute by saying that, I'm saying that they're actually not theologically accurate. They just sound like they are. You don't go to the science. You go to the source that people respect. And if they're Christian, I would go to the Bible. And very conveniently, in Genesis 1, it says God gave humans responsibility over every living thing on this planet. Genesis chapter 1. And then at the very end of the Christian Bible in Revelation, it says God will destroy those who destroy the earth. So it's very clear that there's human agency to destroy the earth, and God does not like that. So that's really a very easily disproven myth. And then the second most common myth is, well, it's all going to be destroyed anyway, so why does it matter?
Oh, God.
Yes. And, as a scientist, I do know that the sun will grow over time and eventually envelop the earth and destroy it. So yes, in the very distant future, the earth will be destroyed.
Right.
That is that's scientifically accurate. But the thing I love about people is that, people were people even 2,000 years ago. And so in the New Testament in the Bible, there were people back then who were like, oh, the world's going to end anyways. Jesus is going to return. So they were quitting their jobs, and they were basically just putting their feet up in the lazy boy chair of life and being like, come, Lord, come. And the Apostle Paul, never a very patient person, wrote to them and basically said, get a job. Care for the widows and the poor. There's things that you need to be doing right now. You don't know when the end is. And so, get busy sharing God's love with others. So whatever these objections are, I love that there's actually answers in the same text that people think these arguments come from.
But don't people misinterpret that Genesis where he says gave us stewardship over the earth to excuse dominating the earth rather than caring for it? Isn't that a debate?
That is a common misreading. And to address that, I do something that's called a manuscript study, where you just basically you go back to the original Hebrew and you're like, okay, what's the word in Hebrew? And the word they're used for that I translate as having responsibility over, or the old King James Bible translated as having dominion over, is the Hebrew word rada, which I'm not a Hebrew scholar. So it's R-A-D-A-H. So here's the thing. You go throughout the rest of the Bible and you look for where else that same word is used. Mm-hmm. And then in other places, that word is used to describe God's rule. And it is specifically used in the Psalms to describe a ruler who has compassion on the needy and listens to the cry of the poor. So if you actually go to the same Bible and you take having compassion on the needy and listening to the cry of the poor, and you put that into Genesis 1, where it says to do that for all living things, oh my gosh, if everybody who claimed to believe and follow the Bible was actually living according to that standard, we would live in a radically different world, and climate change would be in our rearview mirror, as would the biodiversity crisis, as would poverty.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you see how James Tallarico, who's running for Senate in Texas, is talking about Christianity and the Bible in progressive and original ways, I would say, and he's resonating with people. So now, what about? I also have heard you say to skeptics, religious skeptics, that God gave us free will, and so we have choices we can make. So talk about that.
Oh, So the whole idea of free will versus predestination is one that divides people. In fact, my husband gets hate mail to this day from people who believe we don't have free will. Um, in the Bible, though, the whole discussion of whether you have free will or not is not for individuals, it's for people groups. It's basically Israel was the chosen people of God in the Old Testament. And then the New Testament says that the Gentiles, which are basically the non-Jews, are also included now too. So that's what predestination refers to. And if you just look around at this world, clearly humans have the ability to choose, to make choices that can affect something as big as this planet. I mean, when you set off a nuclear bomb, somebody makes the choice to do that, and that has massive devastation that you can see from space. Right. So the idea that humans can't affect something as big as the planet or don't have the willpower to do so is clearly ridiculous when you just open your eyes and just look at the news every single night. It's just full of humans with free will making decisions, often poorly made decisions that are uninformed by information that would help them make decisions to their benefit and those of everybody else.
Yes, well, that's a great explanation. You know, free will is not at odds with God's will. And, you know, I like the way Pope Francis expressed this. You alluded to this a minute ago. And he said, if you destroy creation, creation will destroy you. Yeah. And this is what we have to help people understand, that if we don't accelerate our transition to this beautiful, cleaner, cheaper, safe energy future that's in our grasp, there's going to be enormous suffering, and it's unnecessary. Mm-hmm. And this is also part of what motivates you as a Christian, right? Talk about that.
Well, it's actually pretty much what entirely motivates me, is the fact that those who've done the least to cause this problem are bearing the brunt of the impacts and have the least ability and the least voice to affect their future. So this applies to the poorest and most vulnerable people today, whether it's people in our own city or on the other side of the world. It applies to people who are younger versus those who are older, because the younger you are, the less control you have over what's going to happen in the future, and we're the ones producing the emissions today. We know that women and children are disproportionately affected more than men. And we know that this is just profoundly unfair. And so the fact that this issue is at its core a justice issue is what made me become a climate scientist, because I figured, you know, I have the ability to be educated. I have the ability to have a voice in a way that others might not be able to. And I feel like it's my responsibility to do everything I can to help fix this problem, because the science says every bit of warming matters. And so literally every bit of warming we prevent will prevent a measurable amount of suffering. I think that's worth fighting for.
Yes, absolutely. At the same time, you know, that's all true and you know, makes such a moral, poignant heart connection that you could cry over what's being done to the most vulnerable. Politically, I would argue that it's not the only way we should talk about this, because we have to convince the vast majority of people that they're being affected by this. Mm-hmm. That in effect, everybody's on the front lines of climate change. There's no escape. You know, if you want to be able to afford food and insurance, if you want to be safe, if you don't want mosquito-borne diseases to come to you, if you don't want wildfire smoke in your lungs, if you don't want your house flooded out, if you don't want, you know, your airports flooded, which is all coming if we don't change.
Or closed down due to extreme heat because the planes can't take off if it's too hot.
That's right. Or Phoenix and Las Vegas running out of water, which they are, because we're heating things up and drying things out. So it's only when you have mass understanding in most people that this is affecting them that we're going to change the politics of this. So, you know, I sometimes have trouble with people in the movement that only talk about this in terms of the most vulnerable. It's very valid and it's very true, and it's grossly unfair, but it's not the only way we should talk about it. Would you agree?
Oh, of course. In fact, if you look at the way I talk about it, you won't hear me talking about that often. Like if you look at my newsletter, Talking Climate, that theme will come up maybe once or twice a year.
Right.
Because the whole point is that just about everyone already has every reason they need to care. Our job is to figure out what that reason is. For the guy with the oil rig on his cap, it was his little daughter. For somebody else, it might be the fact that snow is melting and they're passionate about winter sports. For somebody else, it might be the fact that they can't afford to buy a house because the insurance is too high and you can't get a mortgage if you don't have insurance on your house, and that's rising because of climate change. For a farmer, it might be because they haven't had a decent crop in 20 years because the rainfall patterns are shifting. So our entire job, if we want to be good at what we're doing, I know you would agree, is to figure out why people already care rather than trying to make them care for the same reason we do, and show them that whoever they already are is the perfect person to care.
Yeah, I think that's beautifully said. That really is our job, to spread the word about this. And again, to do it in a way that people understand that we don't have to have all these horrible consequences. We know what to do. My interview guest, David Hochschild, the chair of the California Energy Commission, is also talking about how the state is funding all these experiments in bringing carbon down from the atmosphere. And that he expects to make great progress in making that more efficient and more affordable. And isn't that exciting? Because tell me, as we've talked about, Katharine, nobody should really listen to me. I'm a high school dropout. I never got a high school diploma. I didn't go to college for a day. The notion that I should talk to scientists is a little ridiculous, right?
Not at all. Scientists need translation help.
But my understanding is that the last time in the Earth's geologic history that there was this much carbon dioxide, never mind the methane, in the atmosphere, that the seas were about 70 feet higher than today. And that if we don't take the carbon out of the atmosphere, that'll happen again. No one can say how long it will take. It would probably take many centuries. But from an ethical and moral point of view, what difference does it make how long it's going to take? How can we dare subject our children's children to that? So we're going to have to take some down. As you know, some environmentalists have trouble with that. They consider it a free pass for more polluting, but really it isn't that. We're going to have to do this, and this is where innovation needs to come.
Well, exactly. So what matters is whether the molecule of carbon is in the atmosphere. So whether that molecule is not in the atmosphere because you prevented emissions or because you took it out of the atmosphere doesn't matter to the climate. Although some people would assign moral weights to them, it really doesn't matter. All that matters is if it's there or if it's not there. And when it comes to taking carbon out of the atmosphere, there's this phenomenal technology that's been around for over 3 billion years, and it's called photosynthesis.
Plants.
Yes, that is the number one way we can take carbon out of the atmosphere and put it back into ecosystems and soils where we actually want it, because carbon is a fertilizer. It is the basis of life.
Yeah.
So investing in nature is a huge way to restore ecosystems, restore biodiversity, ensure that our air and our water and all the resources we use continue to be abundant and healthy and clean, and take up carbon too. So
including biodiversity in the ocean.
Exactly. So there's so many amazing ways to invest in protecting, restoring nature. And then once you've done everything you can for nature, which is everything we can for people too, because we people depend on nature for everything, then for the last few drops down the drain, we can invest in expensive technologies like direct air capture that literally sucks carbon out of the atmosphere, and you can bury it deep underground. And if we scale direct air capture as much as we can, it could be taking care of 5% of our emissions by 2050. So there is no silver bullet when it comes to technology. But if we combine nature with direct air capture, with efficiency, with clean energy, with revolutionizing our food systems, with behavioral change, we have more than enough to get it done.
And I should explain to people that you are the chief scientist for the Nature Conservancy, and this is where you work on that, in addition to your role as a climate scientist in Texas. Okay, Catherine, I know we're about to run out of time. It's really fun to talk to you as ever.
Good.
So my last subject, you've had challenges online getting to the people with your content. Some of the big tech platforms have blocked you or limited your reach or deemed you, of all people, too controversial. How's that going? What are you making progress? Do people need to go and write to Mark Zuckerberg and say stop? Like, what's going on?
It is a challenge. And I follow the algorithms very closely because I don't want to waste my time. I don't want to just be banging my head against a brick wall. So for a long time, I was very active on Twitter. But when it was taken over by Elon Musk, they changed the algorithm such that my reach plummeted and my trolling increased by at least minimum a factor of 10. And so it just isn't worth putting in the time to be posting things that nobody sees except for a growing avalanche of trolls. On Facebook, my Facebook page, which had been growing very healthily for a long time, when Facebook decided that clean energy and climate change were political topics in August 2018, my page got shadowbanned and it got frozen until this last December. And then in December, they changed the algorithm again because they wanted to promote conflict. So now they boost my posts into the feeds of people who don't want to see climate-related posts so that you get the trolls. And similarly on Threads, my Threads account was growing at the same speed as Blue Sky until the US election. And then Blue Sky continued to grow and Threads froze and dropped. So it really is an uphill battle online to get truthful, accurate information out. It is not a level playing field in any way, shape, or form. And that's without the fact that my work is completely unfunded, whereas those who say climate change isn't real get millions of dollars to boost their videos on YouTube and their Facebook posts into people's feeds. It really is, I feel a lot like a Girl Scout sort of against the Marines. We need, and I know this is something you agree with too, we need people to understand that communication is a climate solution. And if we don't invest in communication, it's like knocking over the first domino in this long row of dominoes that will lead us to a better future. If we ignore the first domino and we keep trying to knock over one domino at a time independently, we're missing the biggest lever we have to catalyze societal change.
Yeah, I call it, we're practicing a unilateral information disarmament.
Yes.
We're letting the bad actors dominate. They're well-funded, but the problem isn't only that they have money and we don't. And part of why we don't have money to do this is that our community doesn't think this kind of work is important. They have what the great linguist George Lakoff calls the Enlightenment fallacy, the idea that a piece of science or a policy idea is so intrinsically brilliant that it magically convinces people in power and reproduces itself. And folks, it isn't true. And those business school grads running the oil, coal, and gas companies, they know it isn't true. So they work on distorting public knowledge, and we need to undo it. And it takes resources. So that's a good way to end. Those of you watching this who want to help, please write to hello@fentonforecast.com, hello@fentonforecast.com, and I'll send your messages to Katharine. You can also contact her through her website, which is katharinehahoe.com. Is that right?
Yep.
And that's with a K, Katharine, and HAYHOE.com. Katharine, wonderful to spend time with you. Thanks for helping to explain all this to people. Thanks for all that you do for our magical Earth.
Thank you, David, for everything you do as well to help us all talk about this in a better way and hopefully a much more impactful way.
Okay, terrific. Thank you. So long.